Ah, welcome. Warm yourself by the fire. Have a seat or snuggle up in your favorite spot and let me tell you a story. And now, The Hauntings and Mysteries of Lausdree Castle by Elliott O'Donnell. It has been many years ago since I was on a walking tour in the Highlands, far to the north of Bonnie Glen Shee. And when on the moorlands, I was overtaken for my sins by a regular American snowstorm, a genuine blizzard of some most pronounced type. I struggled along as well as I could for some considerable time, and then I became aware that someone was beside me. It was a young Highland lass with plaid over her head. I was pleased to learn from her that her name was Jean, and that she was the niece of a neighboring innkeeper, and that she would speedily convey me to his haven of rest. We trudged along in the blinding snow without a word, and I was more thankful to the lass when I, at last, found myself out of the snow in a nice little sanded parlor with a glorious fire of peat and logs blazing on the hospitable hearth. A glass of something hot, brought by my host, was most welcome. I found there was one other storm-stayed traveler in the wee little house, an old family butler, whose name I discovered was Jeremiah Anklebone. He had been on a visit to relations in the north, and had been caught in the snow like myself. We were both thankful to find such a warm, cozy shanty on such an inclement evening. And to use a Scots term, we foregathered at the Ingleside. He asked me if I knew about spirits, to which I replied that I had just had a glass, but he at once explained that although not adverse to toddy, he alluded to spirits of another nature, vis-a-vis ghosts, banshees, boggarts, and the like. I told him I had frequently been in so-called haunted places in various countries, but had never seen or heard anything except owls, bats, rats, or mice. He ventured the remark I had often heard before, that I could not be receptive, and I told him I was thankful that I was not. He was a fine old fellow, an ideal family butler, and doubtless the recipient of many family secrets. He had big mutton-chopped whiskers and a bald head, and looked as if he had served turtle soup all his life, but it was not soup he was soaked with. He seemed fairly saturated with spook lore. He informed me, quite calmly, that he was gifted with the remarkable faculty of seeing apparitions, demons, etc. I could not help remarking that it seemed a very unpleasant faculty to possess, but he quite differed with me, and got as warm as his toddy on the subject. I shall not in a hurry forget that wild evening in the Highland Inn before the blazing fire, or the wonderful narrations I heard from Butler Anklebone. Space precludes me from putting down here all the marvels that he revealed to me. It seemed all his life, he was 62, he had been gasping like a fish on a riverbank to get into a really well-haunted house, but had utterly failed till he took the post of head butler at Lausdree Castle, which he informed me was but a short distance from St. Andrews. He gave me a most tremendous description of the old castle, and from his account it seemed to be the asylum and gathering place of all the bogies in Britain and elsewhere. Congregated together, there were the Ice Maid, the Brown Lady, a headless man, a cold lad, a black maiden, the Flaming Ghost, the Wandering Monk, a ghost called Silky, Old Martha, a Radiant Bay, an Iron Knight, a Creeping Ghost, Jumping Jock, Old No-Legs, Great Eyes, a Talking Dog, the Corby Craw, a Floating Head, a Dead Hand, Bleeding Footprints, and many other curious creatures, far too numerous to mention. The castle, he said, was full of uncouth and most peculiar sights and sounds, including rappings and hammerings, shrieks, groans, crashings, wailings, and the like. What a remarkable place, I said to Mr. Butler Anklebone. And how do you account for so many specters in such a limited area? No, there's no time or space for them, he said. They are earthbound spirits and can go from one part of the globe to the other in a second. But they have their favorite haunts and meeting places just as we folks have, and Lausdree seems to appeal to their very tastes. He then went on to tell me some details of the haunted castle. There are supposed to be, he said, beneath the castle, splendid old apartments, dungeons, winding passages, and cellars. But history states that any of those persons who tried to investigate these mysteries returned no more. So the entrances were walled up and are now completely lost to sight. There's a built-up chamber, but no one dares open it, the penalty being total blindness or death, and such cases are on record. There is also a coffin room shaped exactly like its name, but one of the queerest places at Lausdree is a small apartment with a weird light of its own. At night, this room can be seen from the old garden, showing a pale, uncanny, phosphorescent glow. Mr. Snaggers, the footman, and I unlocked the door and examined the place carefully. There's a table, a sofa, and a few old chairs therein, and all-pervading sickly light, equally diffused. The furniture throws no shadow whatever. The room seemed very chilly, but there was a feeling as if one's vitality was being sucked out of one's body, and drawing one's breath caused pain. Snaggers felt the same. No one could live long in that eerie apartment. I know we were glad to lock it up again. Then there's a spiral stair called Meg's Leg. I don't know the legend, but almost every night one hears her leg stumping up and down these steps. What a creepy place it must be, I murmured gravely. Yes, said Anklebone, and I tell you, sir, Snaggers and I generally arranged to go up to bed together. One always felt there was something coming up the stairs behind one. When a person stopped, it stopped also, and one could hear it breathing and panting, but nothing was to be seen. Snaggers said one night that when the candle went out, he saw monstrous red eyes, but I saw nothing then. The creeping creature I only saw twice. It was like an enormous toad on spider's legs. They say it has a human head and face, but I only saw its back. Some folks say it is alive and not a ghost, and that it hides somewhere in the cellars, but we could never get a trace of it. One night I was going down to the service room when my way was barred by a ghastly tall figure with great holes where the eyes should have been. So I just shut my eyes and rushed through it down the stairs. When I got down, I found all my clothes were covered with a vile, sickly, smelly sort of oil, and I had to destroy them all. Go on, please, I said. You astonish me vastly. Yes, he said slowly. It's all very queer. Lausdree is haunted, and no mistake. Snaggers and I shared the same room. One night a great blood-stained hand and arm came around the corner of the bed curtain and tried to grab me. It was dead ice cold, too. Then a thing, an invisible thing, used to patter into the room, puffing and groaning, and get under the bed and heave it up, but we looked and there was never anything there. The door was always locked. We saw a great black corkscrew thing one night fall from the ceiling onto the floor and disappear. And then there was a mighty rush along the passage. Outside the door, a great crash, a yell and a groan, dying far away below. There was a humorous spirit as well, the Iron Knight. We called him Uncle. He was up to all kinds of tricks. We didn't really mind him. When the fat cook was sitting down to a meal, he'd pull back on her chair, and down she would come with a rare crash. If any of the maids upset a tray of tea, or fell downstairs with the kettle, or knocked over the great urn, they used to say, "Uh-oh, that uncle, he's at it again." I told him, Mr. Anklebone, that I was delighted there was a touch of comedy in such a gruesome place, as I preferred comedians to ghosts any day. One thing I learned from his story was that if he was head butler at Lausdree Castle, head ghost was Sir Guy Ravelstock, whose portrait still hung in the old picture gallery. The castle dated back to Norman times, but about 1457 it fell into the hands of Sir Guy Ravelstock, who had been educated at the Stadium General or University of St. Andrews. He and his two friends, Geoffrey de Beaumanière and Roger Le Corvelet, held high revel and carnival in the old halls of Lausdree, and were the terror of the whole countryside. Sir Guy was a dissolute fellow, a gambler, and everything else bad. The neighbors alleged that he had sold himself to Old Nick. He would spill blood as if it was water, and he and his white steed, No-Go, were well known all over Fife and the Lothians. He was held to be a freebooter, a wizard and a warlock, a highwayman, a pirate, and a general desperado. He had slain many men in mortal combat and was found invulnerable. He must have been a sort of Michael Scott of Balwearie, I remarked. "He must have been a holy terror," said the butler. "I've seen him often, exactly like his portrait in the picture gallery. I've seen him in his old-world dress, with his sword hanging at his side, sometimes on his white horse and sometimes on foot. There were always terrible knockings, shrieks, and crashes before he appeared, and all our dogs showed the greatest terror. I slept in an old four-poster bed, and he used to draw aside the curtain and glare at me constantly. He nearly always was accompanied by the specter of a Negro carrying his head under his arm. Sir Guy was a great traveler in foreign lands, and, I have been told, used to bring back all sorts of curious animals and insects with him. Perhaps the great toad thing I saw was one of those creatures. I've heard toads live for ages." I said I believed that was quite true. "I found a queer place one day," said Anklebone. "I was going up the turret staircase and found some of the steps moved back. I got Mr. Snaggers and Darkgood, the gardener, and we tugged them out. We called the master, and then we found narrow steps going down to a locked door. We forced it open and got into a stone chamber. There were skulls and bones all over the place. Most of them belonged to animals, but there was a horrible thing on the floor, a sort of mummified vampire bat with huge teeth and enormous outstretched wings like thick parchment and 4 legs. Perhaps it was a regular vampire. They fanned folks to sleep with their great wings and then sucked their blood dry. We cleared out the room and buried all the things in the wood." "Now," said Anklebone, "I will tell you the end of Sir Guy Ravelstock. He brought back with him from them foreign parts a Negro servant, and they called him the Apostle. Well, one night," continued Anklebone, "he and his chums were dining and full of wine, and the Apostle offended them somehow. Sir Guy stabbed him. Then they chained his hands and feet together and took him to the dungeon and filled his mouth and nose and ears full of clay and left him. That is the Negro ghost I always saw with Sir Guy. That poor murdered Negro. About 2 years after, Sir Guy and his friends were in the same room drinking when there came a great hammering at the castle door. Sir Guy drew his sword, flung open the door, and plunged out into the darkness. A few moments passed, then his friends rushed out on hearing wild, unearthly shrieks, but there was no Sir Guy to be seen. He had totally disappeared and was never heard of or seen in life again. We found his remains 3 years ago, but I will tell you of that directly. One day, Snaggers and I had gone to St. Andrew's to buy things. We were just at the end of South Street when a horseman dashed past at full gallop. "Heavens," said Snaggers, "it's Sir Guy as I live." He went bang into the big iron gates of the cathedral. When we came up to the great gates, they were locked, and there was Sir Guy, leaning up against the west gable scowling at us, but the white horse had gone, and then he just melted away as we looked. I saw him again with the Negro at Magus Moor, and alone one dark night in North Street. I was alone one evening in the room below the banquet hall, Lausdree, and heard a pattering on the table. On looking up, I saw a stain in the ceiling, and drops of blood were dropping down on the table and the floor. The room above was the very place where the Negro had been stabbed. The next morning we went into the room where I saw the blood drip, and there was the mark of a bloody hand on the table, but no stain on the roof. Now for the discovery. I had often dreamed about an old, overgrown well there in the gardens, and felt very suspicious of what might be therein. Then the gardener and the old man told me that they had frequently seen the awful specter of Sir Guy and the Apostle hovering around the thicket that enclosed what was known as the haunted well, and then vanish into the brushwood without disturbing it. I felt sure that there lay the mystery of Sir Ravelstock. This idea was soon after confirmed by a curious occurrence. One morning, Snaggers was dusting an old oil painting over the huge mantelpiece and above the weeping stone in the great hall, when somehow or other he contrived to touch a secret spring and the painting flew back, opening in its frame and revealing a chamber beyond. We sent for Master and got down by some steps into the room. Such a queer place. It was octagonal in shape, and there had been either a great fire or an explosion there. The vaulted stone roof and floor were all blackened and cracked, and the fireplace and wood paneling were all burnt and charred. "Perhaps the chapel," I remarked. "That's what the master said," replied the butler, and there were remains of burnt tapestry and charred wood and documents all over the stone floor. Master got one piece of burnt paper with faded writing on it in some foreign tongue. The odd thing about it was the big picture. The eyes were sort of convex-like, and 2 holes were bored into the pupil of each eye so that anyone standing at the top of the stone stairs could see all that took place in the great hall below, and hear it also. Master took the piece of parchment and managed to make out a few words. They were, "I am sure that Ravelstock lies in the old prior's well with the dead Negro servant we placed there. I would not go near that spot for my life. Heaven grant it, they may not come for me. I must leave the place." That was all he could decipher on the burnt paper. "You must explore the prior's well, evidently that is its name, tomorrow morning," said our master. We were all up at dawn and got all the men available to cut down the shrubs, bushes, and the undergrowth round the well. the growth of ages. When the well was exposed, it looked very like the Holy Well at St. Andrew's, only it had been a very fine carved and ornamented one at the time. The entrance was a Norman archway, and the remains of an old oak door still hung there. We found a shallow bath-shaped pool of muddy water inside, and a lot of broken stones and bits of old statues and glass. At the far end was a large square opening a few feet above the pool of water. We, of course, made for this and found there was a cell beyond. The whole well on one side was riven and rent either by lightning or the effects of an earthquake. If that ancient well could have spoken, it would have told us some pretty queer tales as St. Rule's Towers at St. Andrew's. There was a most curious, overpowering, sickening odor inside the place, like a vault or charnel house. I remarked that I knew no smells worse than acetylene gas or the awful smell I unearthed when digging long ago opposite the St. Andrew's Cathedral. "Well," said Anklebone, "I can't imagine a worse odor than there was beside that of the Prior's Well. It turned us all faint. We had to get some brandy. We got into the far cell, and there were 2 skeletons on the flagged floor. One was a blanched skeleton as far as the neck, but the skull was well preserved, and matted black hair still clung on it and around the jaws. All the teeth were in their place. Some rings had fallen from the bony fingers, and a sword, all eaten away by rust, lay beside the skeleton. The other was like a mummified ape of a dark oak color, the nails on the fingers and toes being quite perfect. Chains, also almost worn away, hung around the feet and hands. "Good heavens," said the master, "it's Sir Guy Ravelstock and the murdered apostle." There was no doubt of that whatsoever. We had them removed and buried at once. The mystery was solved after all these long years. The Negro had been placed there, but the mystery of Sir Guy was inexplicable. Who came for him that night when he rushed out of the door at Lausdree Castle centuries ago with his sword, and who'd carried him to his doom in the Friar's Well? No one can answer that terrible question now. That old well, if that old well could speak and reveal its secrets. The end.